Okay, so welcome to Working with Web Services in Power BI and M. I hope you appreciate the alliteration in the title. Perhaps I can work some onomatopoeia into my presentation style. Sorry. That was a bad idea to start. Okay, so before we start, this is your chance to leave. I'm going to assume that you know some M. You're not going to be able to work with web services unless you know some basic M. We are not going to be doing massively complicated coding here. The statements that I write are going to be no more than a couple of lines in each case, but I am going to assume that you know what the M language looks like and roughly how you write it. I'm also going to assume that you know roughly what a web service is. Again, we're not going to be doing anything massively complicated because we can't really do anything massively complicated in M. But there is going to be some code. There aren't going to be any flashy demos. There aren't going to be any nice data visualizations. But we are going to learn absolutely everything that I know about working with web services in M. Now, this is going to be a session where I do all of my demos in Power BI Desktop, but as always, everything that you can do in M in Power BI Desktop will also work in exactly the same way in M in the query editor in Excel, Get and Transform, Power Query, whatever you want to call it today. And so we will look at using the web.contents function to make get and post requests, and look at all of the various different options inside web.contents for handling authentication, passing JSON into a web service, handling HTTP errors, controlling caching, adding delays, timeouts, all of these things. And then we will spend the last section talking about data refresh. I had some mildly bad feedback from my session yesterday on parameters and functions because I saved the bad news to the end saying, well, some of this stuff you can't get at when you're refreshing. I'm not going to leave the bad news up to the end. Some of this stuff does not work through the enterprise gateway when you're trying to refresh. But guess what? There is the Ask the Expert stand right outside. Go and find Matt Mason. People say he looks a bit like me. So look for the guy like me with a harried look and the crowd of angry Power Query and Power BI users around him and say, we need this stuff to work properly through the enterprise gateway. All right, so we can get data from web services inside Power BI, inside M. Now, there is a little bit of limited support for this inside the UI. There is a from web option, and if you pass it a URL, it will generate the required code, but the UI is extremely limited. And indeed, I have seen, I don't know whether it's been fixed, I have seen there are some bugs where some things that you do set up in the UI don't get translated back to the code. So personally, whenever I'm doing any of this, I always write the code myself manually in the advanced editor to get that old-fashioned notepad feel for writing code, because after all, who needs IntelliSense or things like that? The other thing that I'm going to need for a demo like this is some web services to call. And this being the Data Insight Summit, and given that we're kind of all closely related to Power Apps and Flow, most of my web services are going to be built using Microsoft Flow. So let me explain some context here. Who's played with Microsoft Flow? It's pretty cool. It's pretty fun. And actually, it's got a lot better since I first started looking at it about a year or so ago. But Flow is basically like if this then that and all of those other services out there for automation. And one of the things that you can do is build flows that are triggered by a request to a web service, and they can do some stuff, and the web service can then give you a response. So let's have a look at a very, very basic web service that doesn't really do anything much interesting. Here is a flow. If I go to Edit Flow, I've got two parts, a request and a response. Now, when I have a request trigger, this builds the the endpoint for the web service. I can get the URL for that web service here. It is a horribly long URL, but we'll get used to that. We've got some advanced options, like, for example, is this going to be a get or a post? We'll have a look at some of these options a bit later. And then in the response, we can say, well, what's the status code it's going to return? And we've got, optionally, something that we can send back in the body, and this web service is just going to say hello. So I can call this web service by copying the URL here, and let's just build a new source. I'm going to go to Other, choose From Web, and I can paste this in. So here I've got two options, basic and advanced. If we go to advanced, you can see that we can paste in the URL either as a whole or break it up into multiple different parts, which might make it a little bit more legible. Power BI will glue it all together to give you a complete, glue each part together to give you a complete URL. And we've got some other options in here. We can add HTTP headers. I'm going to show you how to do all of this in code a bit later anyway. But having done that, we click OK. Let's do that. We've built a query. It's got a horrible name, but we've hit the web service. And the other cool thing about this is that if I refresh this, under run history, well, in a minute, we will see that this has been accessed. Oh, come on, it's working perfectly. But I'm going to be relying on this, so a demo a bit later is probably going to fail if this doesn't update nicely. But we'll be able to see inside Flow that we've hit a web service. And as we'll see in a minute, we're going to be able to do some slightly more sophisticated things inside Flow to build our web services. Now, everything behind the scenes comes down to the web.contents function in M. This is going to be the main function, or the only function that you're going to use to get data from a web service. You are only allowed to make get and post requests in M. You can't make any other type of HTTP request because this is a reporting tool, folks. You are getting data for reporting purposes. You are not updating data anywhere. You're not deleting stuff. You're not going to be doing anything else sophisticated that you might possibly be doing with web services. That's why you've got these restrictions in place. As I was saying a little bit earlier before the session started, these requests could be executed more than once in certain scenarios. So if you were updating or deleting or inserting, you can't guarantee that a request only gets made once. So this is why only get and post requests are allowed. So let's have a look at some of these things. So I'm going to delete that. And let's have a look at the code that would be used for a simple GET request. We've got a very long URL here, but really there's nothing to see apart from the fact that inside my single step inside this query, I am calling web.contents with the URL for that web service that I just showed you. And then what's coming back is going to be treated as a bit of text in line with lines in. So I've got the lines.binary function, lines from binary function that says, well, interpret the request as a bit of text, and then turn that into a table with just one column in. This is all stuff that's been generated automatically by the UI. I've just formatted it to make it look a little bit easier to read. So that's how we make a simple GET request. We're not passing anything into it. We might want to be able to make a POST request. So let's have a look at a web service that I've got here that makes a POST request. So this is a little bit more complicated in Flow. Now here, I've got a request trigger. Under method, I'm saying this is going to be a POST request. Here I could specify a JSON schema for what I'm passing in, but I don't need to. I'm just going to pass in a bit of text. And then here in the middle of Flow, I'm calling the Microsoft Translator Service. And I'm saying, well, whatever I'm passed in the body of the request, let's translate it from English to French. I could give it a little bit more of a hint and give it a category, but it's going to translate from English to French, and then it's going to take that text and pass it back in the response. So, nice, easy web service that will take a bit of text, translate it, and give me back the French equivalent. In order to make a post request, we've still got the same call to web.contents, and everything that's not shown here on screen is just that horrible long URL, which you don't need to worry too much about now. But the important thing here is that we've got a second parameter. Now, this second parameter here is enclosed in square brackets. That means that what we're passing in M is a record. And a record you can think about as being a table with one row in it and multiple columns. And in that table with multiple columns and one row, we can specify kind of column headers. And in this case, actually, in my record, I've only got one field in there. It's called content. And in content, I'm saying, OK, call the text to binary function. I am passing in the text hello. And that's going to be converted to a binary value, which will be put in the payload, sent to the web service, and then I will get the translated text back. This is our first look at one of the options we've got with the web.contents function. And if I refresh this, you will see somewhat controversially, it's translated hello to salut rather than bonjour. So it's obviously a very informal translation. But that works. Whenever the content option is specified for web.contents, Power BI will make a post request. If it's not there, it will make a GET request. That's how you choose whether you're going to use a GET request or a POST request. Now, this URL here, as you can see, is horrible. Let's bump up the font here to something really, really big that you'll be able to see, and paste it in here. Yeah. That's not really very nice, but you can see that we've got a couple of things here at the end, query string parameters. These are things that we might want to configure, we might want to change. And in terms of other options that we've got available with the web.contents function, we can actually break this up into something more legible. This is not something that the UI will do. Remember earlier we saw in the UI, we could break up a URL into multiple pieces. That's very unsophisticated. It's just basically paste in some code and it concatenates it all together. But the web.contents function understands roughly how these requests can be constructed. And it knows that there might be a kind of root URL, there might be some things that we might want to tack onto that root URL, and there might be some other query parameters that we might want to pass through as well. So let's have a look at this. So here is a rewritten version of a request to my basic web service. We've still got that first parameter for web.contents. It's still that horrible, horrible long URL. But now I've got some extra things here. I've got the relative path option, where I'm just tacking hello onto the end of the URL. And then I've got the query option here. And in the query option, you'll see that, for example, here we've got a SIG thing here with, basically this is a password, a key or of some kind. Well, I'm assuming it is. The documentation is very sparse. But I can break my request up here. And let's look at the code again. And you can see it basically allows you to break things up. And if you were dynamically generating this URL, then it makes it a lot easier for you to dynamically generate and make your code a lot more legible. There are other benefits to doing this, which we will talk about a little bit later. But at the moment, just just appreciate that it makes your code a lot easier to run. Actually, I told a lie. This isn't my original web service. This is a slightly more sophisticated one where if we go to here and edit the flow, flow allows you to kind of have a slightly more complicated URL structure. So it allows me to take the base URL of the web service, tack the word message on the end, and then here message text is any bit of text that I add onto the end of the URL. And that's going to be a bit of text like hello that I'll pass over to the web service. And then in the response, the web service says the message was message text. So in my example here, I'm adding hello, and when I click on this, well, it's treated as a CSV file, but we'll forgive it. But you can see that it's saying the message was hello. So again, nothing very sophisticated, but very useful. Okay, moving on. We might want to be able to do some authentication. This is where the story gets less pleasant, or we start to hit some limitations. So in this case, with Flow, we've got this gigantic list of parameters that are being passed to the web service, and one of them, I believe, is something like a key or a password. So we don't want anybody being able to call our web service. We want to be able to restrict it somehow. Now, before, I was just copying an entire URL and pasting it into my code. And in Power BI Desktop and in Excel, there is no way of stopping anybody who's got access to the Power BI file or the Excel file from being able to see my code. They will always be able to open the query editor. They will always be able to look at the code, which means that potentially, if I was just using the URL as is, they would be able to see my password, which would not be a good thing. I don't want to give my password away to everybody. Now, if, as in this case, I am passing in the password or key or whatever through the URL, I've got another option for securing this. So remember, if we go to here, remember I said that SIG was going to be my key or password. I've got another option here called API key name. Now, when I put that option inside the web.context second parameter record thingy, then that basically says inside the request that I'm making, SIG is going to be where my key or password lives. And when the query runs, and when Power BI realizes that the API key name is there, what we will get is this box in the preview. And it says, hold on, we need to enter some credentials. Now, let me copy this very carefully, because that's going to be my key. Obviously, this is ridiculous, because this is going to be recording, and anybody who's like really good at typing is going to be able to view the recording and see my password. But I'm not paying for this, so you can call this web service if you want. Let's hit the edit credentials. Now, in this case, you can see that the UI is telling me a web API key credential is required when the web API key name is provided. I go to web API. I can enter the key, click connect, and the web service runs. Now, what's happened here is that when I entered that key into that dialog, this was stored in Power BI's own secure credential store. just the same as if you were connecting to Oracle with a username and a password, or any other data source where you need to enter usernames and passwords or anything else secure. Same thing happens in Power Query and Excel. Now, this is stored on your machine, but it is not stored in the Power BI file. So on subsequent runs, you will be able to refresh this, and that key will be brought back from the credentials store, and it should all work. So there we are, we refresh that, and it still works. But if I was to save this, and I was to email it over to Paul, when Paul tries to open up the query editor and refresh this, he will get prompted for the key, because it doesn't exist in the credential store on his PC. So he will either know the key and be able to enter it and it will work, or it will not work. A lot of people complain about this kind of behavior, especially in the Excel world, because people building Excel applications are used to embedding passwords and things inside Excel files. Strictly speaking, this is probably a bad thing to do, but at least I have a little bit of sympathy for the people in the Excel world who struggle with these types of things. But there we go. That's how you use the API key name option. If you are trying to do anything more complicated, for example, you needed to pass a key through an HTTP header, or you were trying to do something using, say, OAuth 2, you are in trouble. There are various blog entries out there showing how you could, for example, connect to the Twitter web service and negotiate OAuth 2 and all of those complicated things. But to be honest, it is not worth the hassle. It is not going to work well. They are all very, very manual and unsupportable solutions. So ultimately, if you want to be able to connect to a more complicated web service that has more complicated authentication requirements than the one I've just shown you, you are not going to be able to do it. We do now have the ability to build custom data connectors in M. This was something that was released a couple of weeks ago in preview. So ultimately, we are going to be able to build our own custom data connectors. And custom data connectors are basically all of the things that you see here. So for example, if we were looking at some of these online services like Salesforce Objects or Salesforce Reports, effectively somebody has gone away and built a custom data connector for this. Now, some of these services are services that have more complex authentication requirements, and it turns out that with a custom data connector, you can handle much more complex authentication. If you are interested in learning about that, go to GitHub and find the Microsoft Data Connectors repo. There is some pretty good documentation in there, but that's kind of outside the scope of this talk. So that's our first bit of bad news out of the way. Now, if we go back to post requests, what I showed earlier was literally just passing a bit of text through to the web service and getting a translated version back. But in a lot of cases, we can't just pass text through, or maybe the text needs to be formatted in a particular way. Maybe we need to pass a bit of JSON through to the web service in the payload of the post request. So this is where we can take a little bit of a detour and see how in M we can actually generate JSON very easily. So what I've got here is a sample function which uses the JSON from value function in M, which serves all of your needs here. You pass it a value, and this can be a primitive type. It can be M types like lists or tables, and it will convert it to some particular JSON equivalent. So for example, if I was to take this, and let's build a new query. What I've got here is a list in M containing some fruit. Now, this is a list. If I run this query, we get a list with pineapple, peach, pear in it. I've got a function that I can call, which, like I said, earlier, if we look at the code here, it basically takes a bit of text, uses JSON from value, and then so that we can see the JSON that's output, it uses text from binary. So if I call my getJSON function on this, like so. So getJSON is the name of that function that I've just declared. Click done. You can see that from a list we get a, that's a bit fuzzy, isn't it? Or is that my eyesight? An array back. Now, if I copy this and we go back to flow, now this is going to be an interesting thing. This is where I can be as unpleasant as I like about flow because I'm a Power BI person. When I was planning this demo, I thought, well, OK, what I want to be able to do is instead of passing one value to be translated to French, let's pass a list of fruit names to be translated into French. And I built my flow, and I said, OK, we're going to pass in the JSON value in here. Flow makes it really nice and easy to generate a schema from a sample payload. So I'm just saying, well, pass in a JSON array with a list of fruit names in. And then what I was going to do is I was going to basically initialize an empty string, loop over the array, call the translate web service, and concatenate all the strings together and return a concatenated list of French fruit names. And I was doing this, and it seemed fairly straightforward. And then I saved the flow, and I got an error. And it was like, oh, OK, this is a bit disappointing. And I couldn't get rid of this error. And then I thought, oh, well, OK, I'd spent 15 minutes on it at this point. So I'll just do something simpler and do this instead, which is basically loop over the array and count the number of items. And I saved this, and it worked. And then I thought, well, it's time to test the web service. And I passed in my list of fruit names. And guess what? I get the French translated list of fruit names back. So I have no idea what's going on, but it's what I wanted to do. It's just that Flow has somehow managed to remember what I wanted to do and do it without actually doing it. But basically, here's an example of what I need to do. Content, I'm using JSON from value. It returns a binary value. I'm passing in that list of fruit names. That gets translated into the JSON array, sent over in the post request, and we get the values that we want back. OK, now moving on. Let's have a look at another flow that I've got here, one that returns an error. So there's nothing really much to say here, except that I've got a flow that deliberately returns a 404 error. So things happen, web services fail. And when I call this particular web service, this is what I get. And as you can see, I've got a 404 not found error. We want to be able to handle these situations and fail gracefully when our web service is not working properly. Now, most of the time in M, you would use a try otherwise block to be able to handle errors. So if we go here, you can see that I have a try otherwise block and say, well, let's try web.contents, and if that errors, let's return the text error. Interestingly, when I refresh this, I still get the 404 not found error. This is one of those weird situations where the error handling in M doesn't work properly because this is all done on lazy evaluation, and when it checks the error, it doesn't actually call the web service because it doesn't want to keep on calling the web service, and it's only when the web service is actually called that it realizes it returns the error. There are some things that you can do to trick it into doing it. So for example, here, if I uncomment my JSON.document function here, so all I've done is wrapped web.contents in the JSON.document function. This is enough to trick it into actually evaluating the request. Click done, and you can see that it returns the message error, which is horribly confusing. But at least in some cases, you can trick it into using a try otherwise block properly. But the good news is that there is proper support for this. So instead of having to rely on horrible tricks like this, we've got yet another option for web.contents, which is called manual status handling. You pass in a list of error codes, and when that happens, it will not fail unpleasantly. Now, what happens when you've specified manual status handling, and like I have done here for 404, we get a value back, but we get a value back with some metadata associated with it. All values in M can have a metadata record associated with it. So basically, a number or a bit of text or a table can have another value hidden behind it in the background. And to find that metadata value, all you need to do is use the value.metadata function. We don't know what it is. We know that it's going to be a record. There could be anything in that record. So what I'm doing here is I'm calling the web service. I'm using manual status handling for 404 errors. And I'm calling the value.metadata function to see what that record returns. And in this case, this is what the record returns. And we've got a field called response.status that tells us the response, 404. So I can use this then here to basically say, all right, let's get the metadata, and then let's get the response.status field from that record. And then here we can say if that contains 404, then error, otherwise source, which is my original call to web.content. So this is really how you want to handle errors inside M. Well, I'm going ahead of myself a little bit. There are going to be a lot of situations where if you're hitting a web service repeatedly, somebody at the other end of the web service is thinking, somebody somewhere is doing a distributed denial service attack, so let's not return these requests very, very quickly. You might find in a situation if you were hitting a web service once, it comes back very, very quickly. If you hit it 10 times, suddenly it's not 10 times the amount of time of the original request. It's a minute or so. So kind of counterintuitively, if you are hitting a web service repeatedly, which you may well be doing if you're calling a web service once for every row in a table, it can actually help and make things faster by inserting delays into your code. And we've actually got some support in M for being able to do that, specifically for this scenario. So here, I've got a bit of code which shows how the function.invokeAfter function works. So function.invokeAfter simply takes a function and a duration. So the duration is specified here in days, hours, minutes, and seconds. And I'm specifying a duration of 5 seconds here. And then I'm going to call my function that I've defined up here called getTimeAsText, which will just get the local time now. Not really very interesting, but when I refresh this, we will see that we get the spinny for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And there's my function call. So at this point, it's literally just a very basic demo of how you use function.invokeAfter to insert a delay of a certain number of seconds inside your code. Here's an example of how that might actually work. Remember that function.invokeAfter takes a function. So even though I don't actually really want to pass any parameters to this function in this case, I've still got to declare a function. This is how I declare a function that doesn't have any parameters, and it just returns the content, whatever web.contents returns. But here now I can say, well, source contains the function that I want to invoke. I want to invoke that after 5 seconds. And we can refresh that. You'll see that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We might also want to think about caching as well. So if we're hitting a web service lots and lots of different times, if we're making the same request over and over again, Power BI thinks, well, okay, it would be a bit silly to make that same request over and over again. So within a query, it will cache the return result of a web service. So if you make the same request multiple times, it will only make it once, and then it will use the cached result after that. So what I've got here is a simple function. It's got two parameters, one which is a message, and then an optional parameter, which is just going to be a bit of text. The first time I use it, I'm not going to use that optional parameter. And basically, we pass in the message, and it's going to call that web service that takes that message and returns the text. The message was whatever I passed in. Now, here, I've got a table that contains 3 rows. Each row contains the same word, apple. I'm calling my web service, and it's going to return the French pomme. And if we are lucky, when we go to the translate text web service here, what we'll see is when we refresh, it's hit once 3 seconds ago, which is good. I can stop that caching happening by making the request slightly different each time. So in my original function, I had the option of passing in a second parameter, which was the row number from the original table. And if we were wondering how to pass HTTP headers in, there is a headers option. We can pass in a record in the headers option with a list of header names and then header values. I'm just saying here if the optional parameter is null, then return 1, otherwise do that. And then what I'm doing here is calling that function for each row. Oops, that's this one. And I'm using the function.invoke, the invoke function option to invoke that function for each row in the table, passing in not only the message and the row number. And what we can do here is when we refresh this, even though we're passing in apple, 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 what we should see when we get the refresh value back here is good, those 3 requests. So that's working. But I can stop that happening if I don't want that. And I've got 2 options here. First of all, I've got the excluded from cache key option. So I can say, well, I'm passing a different value into this HTTP header each time, but I don't want that to be included in the caching algorithm. And I can pass in a list of headers like that. Or I've got this is retry equals true option, which, if that's set to true, will also turn off the caching and make sure we make the request. So that's that. I've also got the option here of setting a timeout as well. So there is a timeout option, which again takes a duration. And if I don't want to wait more than 10 seconds, I can do that and it will fail. But I'm going to skip those demos very, very quickly because we need to get on to the very, very last bit, which is talking about data refresh limitations. One of the most frustrating things about Power BI is that there are lots of cool advanced things that you can do in Power BI Desktop that work perfectly in Power BI Desktop, but then when you deploy and you want to do a scheduled refresh, they don't work. Go and find the Power BI team out there and complain about this. So let's see some examples of this. Now, I've got 3 files here. First of all, I've got a file here called call web service succeeds. Let's open this. And in this situation, I'm calling my web service that returns hello 3 times. Not really very interesting. I'm just calling it 3 times. I'm just putting in a simple URL here. I'm not passing anything to the web service. I'm not making any change. I'm just making the same request each time 3 times. And I get hello back 3 times. If we go to Power BI here and look at my data sets, this is the data set after it's been published. I'll be able to refresh that, and it worked. So that's great. Now, let's have a look at something that is going to fail and understand why it's going to fail and what we can do. So the difference is here, I am going to call that web service where I could pass a bit of text in, and it will return the message was. And this situation, I'm taking a great big long URL, and somewhere in here, there is the bit of text in the URL where I've put hash open square brackets param, and the text.format function here will just simply allow me to replace it with a value of message, and message is what's being passed in to here. And then if I run this, we get 3 different values because we made 3 different requests. We built a function, call that function with different parameters 3 times, we get 3 different requests. Works perfectly in Power BI Desktop. We do the refresh here, and we get the evil warning yellow triangle because the request has failed. We can go to Settings, and we can see here that there was an error processing the data set. And you can see here you can't schedule refresh because one of them all, it's completely unhelpful. Basically, the problem is when your query starts to run in the service looks at the call to web.contents, and if the first parameter of web.contents is generated through a function, or it could be dynamic, it fails. Because it's going to call just that first parameter to see if the call works, to check to see whether the credentials you've supplied are OK. Forgetting, of course, that you might be trying to do some authentication in some other way. But anyway, it basically looks at that first parameter that you pass in to see if the request works, and then it will actually make the request. So what can we do about this? Well, I was preparing all of my demos in Flow, and I thought, well, OK, I had a grand finale of doing the demo in Flow and make this web service request work. It turns out that there are tricks to make your web service request work, but they don't work with the URLs that Flow web services generate. So I'm going to have to use a different web service. It's going to be a fairly simple one. But this is a web service provided by the UK government to search for open data sets. And in fact, it's a little bit easier to read than the Flow web service. But for example here, if I take the URL that I've got here, and I pass this in here and type in apples, this is the URL. It has package search, and then the query string that we're searching, the search term is apples, and I get back a chunk of JSON which tells me all of the open data sets that are related to apples in the UK. So it doesn't really matter too much what it does. What really matters is how we're calling it. So here in this version of the code, this is going to fail because I am dynamically generating the entire URL. This is the thing that the Power BI service checks for, and it's going to fail. But the good news is, remember I said it only looks at the first parameter. So if we're using the relative path option or the query option like this, and if that first part of the URL in the first parameter can be called on its own and doesn't return an error, then I can split things up by using the query option, the relative path option. It will, when it's checking the authentication, call that first part of the URL. It works, then run the actual query. So here, for example, I'm saying, well, let's call it for apples, oranges, and pears. Use the query option to supply the Q parameter. Click refresh. That works. And having published that, we'll go back to here. And when I refresh this, you will see that we don't get the unpleasant yellow triangle. It will work. So if you can rewrite your requests to use relative path or query, then you'll be able to call your web service. But that depends completely on how the web service is constructed, which is very, very, very frustrating. Anyway, that brings me to time. I've overrun a little bit into your question time, so hopefully you don't have too many questions. But time for some questions. Yes, sir.
So I've got an app that calls URL using web.contents. URL returns a CSV file.
Mm-hmm.
My source system generates reports that are on a scheduled basis. I can then consume that URL.
Mm-hmm.
Harvest the data.
Don't worry, I'll repeat your question.
Okay, so anyway, the problem is this. Every couple of days or so, it's like the URL goes stale. There's something weird that happens. The refresh either breaks,
Mm-hmm.
the authentication that I'm passing in doesn't work. But if I go get the URL, paste the exact same URL, I mean, there's literally no difference in it, paste it into the query editor, and save it, somehow it now thinks it's brand new, it's refreshed, and it won't work again for a couple of days.
Okay, so the question was, your query refreshes successfully after you've published it, yeah? So it refreshes successfully after you've published it for a couple of days, and then it stops working, and then when you republish with exactly the same code, it starts again. It starts.
Weirder than that, I actually have to go in and open the desktop file, literally select the URL string, paste the exact same URL string into it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess yeah, if you do that, then it feels like it's kind of updated the code. You need to save again.
Right, and so I've got a support ticket open, with no resolution. I'm sort of resigned to, well, I guess I'm going to have to just find a different way to get that data, So
That just sounds like a bug. I mean, there is no way that should be happening. That sounds crazy. So stick at that support ticket and make sure it gets resolved, because I would be interested. I mean, I've not had that problem myself. And I've done a couple of projects where I've been calling web services. I've not run into that, but it does sound very much like a bug that needs to be fixed. Thank you. Yes, sir.
We found that we have to create our web service as old data. We're returning old data. Thank you. My question was, we in our experience, we had to create a web service returning old data. And I'm wondering if you know specific cases where the return has to be in a very specific structure, or what structures it supports, because we had some issues with that.
Okay, with your OData web service.
Well, the OData worked, but
the only way that it would work would be through.
Yeah, we only found it to work with OData, but we would like to just return in other structures.
Okay, well, I mean, it's certainly true that Power BI and Power Query like OData as a format. So I'm not surprised that it works better, but I guess without knowing a bit more about why it wasn't working or the problems, I can't really comment, I'm afraid. Thank you. Yes?
So you talked about authentication and being able to pass a key.
Mm-hmm.
Does that work with RLS? Is it possible to define roles and then pass keys in from like the back end?
So the question was, I can pass in keys through the...
So you talked about authentication
Yes,
and
yep.
prompting a user for a key.
Yep.
will that work with RLS
So row-level security
Yes.
for
your Power BI report?
my Power BI
So
report.
if I define roles and I set filters and I don't want to prompt the user every single time for a key. That
Well,
seems
no,
kinda-
you will only get prompted once per user.
Right. That
So the
still, to
first-
me, feels a little bit hokey, especially when we're dealing with, AAD and
Yeah.
knowing who our users are. and
You
that
have
kind
to
of thing.
remember that this is the developer experience. This is not, unless you're expecting your end users to open up Power BI Desktop, save their own version of the report and then pass it in, which you might be, and I guess that could be a valid thing to do, then I suppose because it's the developer experience, Microsoft thinks that it can do more complicated things, which I think is fair enough.
Okay, so RLS isn't really tied to that type of authentication at this point.
Not really, I don't think,
Okay.
no. Yes, so I'm going to need to wrap up, but I'll be around outside if you want to ask any questions. Thank you.